I call the member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very privileged to rise following the member for Fadden, the member for McPherson, very passionate in relation to what's going to the consequences in relation to this bill. And it's very eloquent the way they put their case across in relation to the impacts upon our communities and their communities. I rise today to speak on behalf of the Macarthur community with regards to the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission Bill 2012. The Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission Consequential and Transitional Bill 2012 and Tax Laws Amendment Special Conditions for Not-for-Profit Concessions Bill 2012. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill represents yet another half-baked idea from this Labor government. Their stated intention and their actual reality are once again two very different creatures. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill was sold to the electorates and the wider public as relief from the burden of red tape facing charities and these organisations operating in the not-for-profit sector. The not-for-profit sector has traditionally operated within many regulations and regimes of Commonwealth, state and territory and local governments, each with their own classifications, reporting requirements and regulations. At face value, a move to consolidate all of these different regulatory and reporting functions to one overarching body should, in theory, reduce the regulatory burden on our charities and not-for-profit sectors. But what we have here is an underhanded move to create an additional layer of federal regulation to the charity and not-for-profit sector without doing anything to reduce existing layers of regulation. This is a bill that Labor is Labor to its bootstraps, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy, creating additional red tape without delivering on the promise or removing or streamlining existing regulatory arrangements. Indeed, as my esteemed colleague, the member for Wright, pointed out, the ACNC's plan for reducing the regulatory burden on the not-for-profit sector is to go to the states and have them reduce their regulatory burden on the sector. What a plan, Madam Deputy Speaker. This government's approach will add yet another layer of bureaucracy to a sector that has already overcome reporting and compliance burdens. And they asked us to believe that by adding this further imposition on not-for-profit organisations, that other reporting and compliance bodies will simply disappear or just reduce their levels of compliance. This is nothing but policy on a run. Now, this is something that's not new to the Labor and Greens alliance, yet another knee-jerk response, as a member for McFadden has said on numerous occasions. In my electorate of Macarthur, our community is blessed with a large number of well-supported charities and an abundance of volunteers willing and ready to lend a hand for the many worthy causes in Macarthur. I have had the honour of visiting and spending time with many of the different charities and not-for-profit organisations during my time as a member for Macarthur. These people, our community volunteers and organisations, are the backbone of our society. I would dare any representative from across the chamber to try and justify this package of bills as beneficial to any charity in Macarthur. And when you look across the chamber, they've struggled all day trying to justify this new bill. Across Australia, there are 600,000 entities which together play a major role in our society. They support our communities poor, sick and disadvantaged. They provide social, cultural, sporting and religious, professional and communal interests for millions of Australians each year. A large number of independent schools are run by charities, not to mention our sporting clubs and welfare agencies, many relying on the hard work and time donated by volunteers. In fact, it is estimated that the hours of work by volunteers within these organisations comes to a dollar value of in excess of $14.6 billion. This is a huge contribution from this sector to the Australian society, a contribution that we should be proud of, and a contribution that we should all do, a contribution that we should all do all we can to support and protect. I think that most, if not all, Australians would agree with the Coalition's view that these volunteers and their organisations should be supported by, not hindered by, the state. We believe their ability to operate and function should not be weighed down by unnecessary red tape and regulations. That is what we in the Coalition and our constituents want to see coming out of this legislation. Yet sadly, but not surprisingly, these bills before us today will achieve just the opposite. It is for this reason that I and the Coalition cannot support this legislation. This legislation has failed to its core objective, which is to cut red tape, to cut the regulatory burden, and not to mention the cost of complying with these regulations. It has even failed to meet its own regulatory impact statement. Many speakers on the other side of the House have spoken about how this legislation has received sector-wide support. Well, this is simply not true. a large number of well-respected large and small charitable organisations have voiced their concerns regarding these bills and oppose the wide-ranging changes the ACNC will bring in their submission to various parliamentary committees and inquiries. As Mission Australia commented in their submissions regarding this suite of bills, we support the notion of the ACNC as one-stop regulatory stop and support the notion of a charity passport that will see us provide our financial and governance information once to be used often. It is disappointing to see no evidence of how this is being achieved. Our overriding concern is that rather than reducing red tape and compliance burden, the ACNC will add another layer of compliance and that nothing will be taken away. The Australian Conservation Foundation stated in their submission that the ACF is concerned that rather than remove duplication and the ACNC bills will duplicate reporting obligations. The Australian Institute of Company Directors stated that we've had a member feedback all saying basically the same thing as we have said. I will quote from one which I think is very pertinent. It comes from an aged care CEO. Every hour we pay for compliance, we lose about 1.5 hours of one-to-one support for our ageing residents. The Australian Council of Social Service stated, the bill does not yet contain any provisions that make it explicit that the reduction of unnecessary compliance and regulatory burdens is a core object of the bill, nor does it identify these kinds of reforms as policy directions or drivers of the ACNC's purpose of activities. There must be a direct link between the reduction of red tape and the objectives and functions of the ACNC. While I am very concerned about the cost of complying with added regulation and red tape, what concerns me even more, Madam Deputy Speaker, are some of the more controversial changes proposed in this legislation, which come in the form of director liabilities, enforcement powers and penalties. The reforms in these bills are insidious and far-reaching. The government have tried to candy coat their objectives so as to draw attention away from the more unpleasant aspects of their own legislation. Some of these reforms include giving the Commission the power to remove responsible office bearers from charities and not-for-profit organisations. Very disconcerting. These powers go so far as to give the Commission power to remove ministers from churches and parishes through the Archbishop of a diocese. Other aspects of this legislation gives the Commission the power to deregister an organisation if it is conducting its affairs in a way that may cause harm to or jeopardise the public trust and confidence in the not-for-profit sector. However, what this legislation does not do is give certainty as to what public trust and confidence will be considered to mean. Churches and large charities, aged care providers, Aboriginal welfare groups, conservation groups, and even through the professional bodies such as the Institute of Company Directors have all tried to draw the government's attention to the various serious consequences for their organisations caused by this legislation. As David Gonski, a Life Fellow of the Institute of Company Directors, said regarding the plethora of changes within these bills, it concerns me massively that we might be the first country in the world to make being on a not-for-profit as a director more onerous than being on a for-profit. Very, very concerning. However, it seems that their genuine concerns have been met with the usual dismissive arrogance we see on a daily basis from the Greens Labor government. The Coalition, on the other side, has a plan to help the charities and the not-for-profit sector. We support a smaller commission with a focus and core understanding to promote innovation, education and advocacy within the charities and not-for-profit sector. The Coalition will cut red tape, not create additional layers of it for our charitable organisations. One of the easiest and effective ways of doing this is through contracting reforms as demonstrated in our proposal in the family services area, which will make it easier for agencies operating in civil society. Every Australian knows and appreciates the good work that our charities and the not-for-profit organisations do for our nation. It is self-evident in the support they receive back from the community through donations, through support for events like the 24-hour Walk for Cancer, the New South Wales Cancer Council's Relay for Life, Red Cross, the Salvation Army Door Knock Appeals, among thousands of other causes. Our charities and not-for-profit organisations do not need these bills and their plethora of rules, regulations, penalties, restrictions and further red tape. They do not need the legal uncertainties created by unsupported phrases like public trust and confidence. They do not need powers given to the ACNC to inflict penalties and controls that are greater than those already in the Corporations Act. As with any organisation, for profit or not for profit, red tape costs money. For charities and not-for-profit organisations, this money does not come easily. I think many Australians would agree that it should be spent on delivering for our communities. An old saying goes along the lines, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is an old truth that underlines many of the concerns that have been raised by organisations about the far-reaching powers under the ACNC. The Corporations Act and case law that underpins the registration, directors' powers and responsibilities has served for the not-for-profit sector well. While there's an issue of red tape and regulations caused by various levels of government regulation, it begs the question of why this government is trying to create a complicated and onerous set of new laws to oversee not-for-profit organisations. These new laws include powers to determine whether or not an organisation of this nature can be registered. Even more disturbing, these new powers give the government the authority to deregister charities and organisations at a whim. It's time this government see the light about what governments should be doing. It's not the role of the government to expand their tentacles to every reach of civil society. This government should get out of the way of civic organisations and support our volunteers and not-for-profits, rather than tying a ball and chain around their ankles to hinder their activities. In fact, if we look at this conundrum from an international example, we are turning back the clock in terms of delivering positive outcomes for our civil society. Our closest neighbour, New Zealand, of which we share many similarities with regulation and legislation, is closing its Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. As reported in Civil Society, the head of the not-for-profit activities in the Australian Taxation Office has noted that efficiency initiatives in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Singapore and elsewhere are also reflecting this trend. It is simply common sense and good government not to create endless reams of red tape for our not-for-profit sector. But legislation reflects this government's fundamental belief that more government, more bureaucracy and more red tape will solve any and all problems in society. The government's heavy-handed approach will do nothing to help our not-for-profit sector. Instead, we need to support our volunteers and organisations that operate in civil society. We should be working with these organisations to lift standards through education and training, rather than imposing overbearing regulation and penalties. For these reasons, I cannot and will not support this legislation, and I would urge all members of the House to do the same.